Hey, everybody. This is Michael and Thomas, and we're making another podcast. We're calling it Just Chilling. And our topic for today is going to be about history. We're going to talk about history because Thomas is about to start taking some more classes, and one of the classes is going to be about history. Now, strange, what I call just my whole life experience is what Thomas would call history, because anything that would go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even the 90s, he would call history. That's the difference between the ages. So we'll start with Thomas, and we're going to let him lead off the discussion on history. Go ahead, Thomas.
Right, right. So history, I think, is really interesting because it feels like just one giant big story. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a never-ending story, like that, like the movie. And even though it feels like one giant story, it affects the stuff that we go through today. What happened yesterday affects today, and what you do today goes to the present. One thing I want to know is what was it like growing up for you? During these large historical events going on. For example, the crack epidemic of the 80s.
For me, like I said, what you think is history, like the crack epidemic. I was a grown person by then, so when I think about history, I think about even further back then, the '60s with civil rights acts or uh, women getting their rights and those kind of things. But I remember those days of those crack pipes and crackheads and all those folks smoking coke and stuff. And no people who were doing that, no friends who were doing that. And the thing that strikes me though now when I look back is that even back then we used to talk about how it was hurting the community and how um, kids were and people were stealing from their parents or stealing from their grandparents and what it was going to mean for their children and how their children were going to turn out. And even then they used to talk about having crackhead babies of people who had misused drugs and how they would turn out and whether they would have physical and medical issues or mental issues. And I think that we've seen some of that in come to pass, where some have had mental issues and some have had even physical issues. Uh, I think it's a tough deal if you want to be doing drugs. You shouldn't be making babies. That's for darn sure. And I think that's one of the lessons that probably came out of that era. The other thing too is I think we were not as compassionate as I think that we should be. You notice nowadays when they have the opioid problems and those concerns with drugs.
Yeah.
Notice how now that gets to be more of a health issue instead of where it was with crack, where it was a criminal issue, which meant that people were going to jail versus going to the doctor and getting help. I think that whole war on drugs thing, I think we can look back now and say, that wasn't a smart move. So that's one of the good things about being old. You can look that far back and say, yeah, I remember when we started that. Wasn't a smart move, didn't make a lot of sense. And now that I'm looking back, nah. So I hope we don't find ourselves in that kind of spot. And I hope that we've learned to be more compassionate. Uh, but it was a wild time when people used to say, just say no.
Just say no.
And just say no solved everything. So is that something that you studied in school?
I mean, we had the DARE program, right?
Yeah.
And that was the basically our version of just say no, but it was more realistic. It's like instead of just saying, oh no, don't just say no to drugs, it'll put you in a scenario. It's like, hey, you want some? It's like, no, I'm okay. You
Yeah.
sure?
Is that the one with the dog with the floppy ears and all
No,
that?
that's the lion.
Oh, okay.
The dog with the floppy ears is just a precursor to that.
The pre. They've been trying to stop that for the longest, and to me, it's sort of like trying to stop a kid from wanting to twirl around and get dizzy. For some reason, people like to be a little bit out of their mind or just a little bit off kilter, and whether they get there from drinking coffee, drinks, or alcohol, whatever it might be, which makes to me the whole kind of war on drug thing to be a useless thing.
Yeah.
Uh,
And the war on drugs went further than just the cities, and people on crack too. That was a global thing, right? Where, for example, the Panama invasion in the '90s, right? That was
yeah,
part of the war on drugs,
yeah,
and the reason why they invaded was because there was two reasons. One, because Noriega was giving the U.S. A hard time with the canal,
Hmm.
and he was going to be like, "No, you can't use it. This is just for us, and we're going to go with China." And America was like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, hold on, hold on, hold on." The secondary reason was because Noriega was also taking over the drug industry that was supplying the CIA for their war on drugs to spread out the crack epidemic. And he was profiteering off of that, and the CIA wasn't getting their cut. So that was the second reason why they invaded.
It's interesting if you go back, a lot of the wars that we end up fighting happen to be in places where they're a resource or they're a place for drugs, whether it's in Southeast Asia, whether it's down in South America, whatever. For some strange reasons, those seem to go together more times than not.
Yeah,
But
like the opium wars in the 1800s, right?
you
With the
got it.
Boxer Rebellion in Britain and China,
Yep,
right?
yep,
They that opium epidemic still affects them to this day, and they started the drug war in the Philippines
right, right.
with China.
All behind somebody's misguided policies.
Uh,
and
for
and it's a good way to use and manipulate folks. I think, and I think that's one of the things that happened with us. People were used and manipulated, even in some cases by their own government, people that they trusted. And you look up now, and folks are in jail, can't get their life together, and all that kind of stuff because of not getting help,
yeah,
and instead uh, getting things to be criminalized. And we don't seem to learn from the history, whether we did it way back with the Boxer Revolution or any other time. We still keep wanting to classify things that maybe should be a sickness as a crime, and and then also people that allows people to try to make money off of it on the black market, which now gets you into crime and which gets you into everything else. So interesting to see how all that stuff has turned out, and
yeah.
interesting to see what they're teaching you guys in school about those times. What else they teach you about the '80s?
The 80s. Oh, the 80s. They teach about something they don't teach about in the 80s is how 70s and 80s is a lot of the domestic terrorist incidents that happened during then. And a lot of the times people will think those domestic terrorist things incidents that had happened were from remnants of the Black Panther movement or the
Mm-hmm.
Move
Mm-hmm.
party, things remnants of the civil rights movement. In reality, they weren't. They were, but they weren't from that side. Um,
Okay.
a lot of those domestic terrorist incidents came from people who were in the military in the Vietnam War, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when this at the same time, the civil rights movement was happening. What happened is that the military they would shut down any, Black Panther or Move or any version of that, for the minorities in the Vietnam. But in the same base, you'll go in, you walk up, you see the Confederate flag hanging next to the American flag, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they didn't do anything about that. They just let that fly.
Yep.
So those people, they would come home, they were like, "This is the America I fought for. I don't like this. They're ruining my heritage and all of that stuff." Right? So then they would use their military training to group up with other people, start their own organizations, right? And a lot of them moved to places like Portland, Oregon, and they have their own. And as you can see, how that affects Oregon today and their political process, and the riots that was happening last year with the police,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and
Well,
that's
I
something
see.
they
It's
don't
that whole
teach.
idea about of how you deal with violence, and whether you dealing with guns, whether you're treating people in a way that that doesn't cause them to want to get mad, upset, and get violent. And even today, I don't know if you've seen it, but even today they had a thing on the news today where some militia guys got stopped in Massachusetts overnight. 15, 20 guys supposed to be going off doing training and fully armed and everything, and just out there on the road. And these guys happen to be black. It's going to be interesting to see how this story turns out over the next couple of days.
Yeah, it's an interesting
It's
story that's going to happen because they might use that law that was in place in the 80s because of those domestic incidents that happened.
even for this one, part of they say is that part of what they were doing was just trying to get noticed because nobody's heard of them.
Yeah,
And now if they get in the news now, everybody's heard on them. It's a whole different idea of dealing with militias, dealing with guns, people wanting to take things in their own hand, and how new technologies can change that whole thing around, so that now you can get publicized on cable news or on the internet or whatever, and now get more people to join your cause and know that you're not out there by yourself. So it's a different thing, and I wonder sometimes when you talk about history whether the founding fathers had these kind of militia in mind. And it's just what they were talking about when they said, well, y'all need to all make sure y'all have guns just in case the government goes crazy. Um, I kind of wonder sometimes.
I think back then they had in mind state sponsored militias. Back then, most militias were state sponsored, right? Although you had a few that were, privately, organized. A lot of them was backed by the state. It wouldn't be the federal state. It would be more like the state of Massachusetts militia, 13th Regiment or something like that, or to be the state of Massachusetts, state of Georgia's 5th Militia Army.
Well, if you dig deep enough, what you find is a whole lot of the folks who helped come up with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, whichever, were also slave owners, and they had a reason to want to do that. They had a reason to want to have militia and to have people armed. I don't think it's necessarily a good reason, and I don't know if we got enough time to talk about it all today, but we can save a conversation later for talking about gun violence, gun control, and those kinds of things. But it's interesting to talk about history. The most interesting to me thing about history is that people say history repeats itself, and history repeats itself. Usually, what they say is history repeats itself because people don't learn from history. But what the reality is that's the part of history that repeats itself, that people don't learn from history. That also happens. So hopefully we'll learn more. And as we talk more, you can get ideas from me being a little older about what things were like in the past. And I can hear more ideas from you about how you think things are going to turn out in the future. Right. What do you think?
Yep, I hope so also.
I think we just chilling.
Yep, just chilling.
Hey, folks, check us out again. We'll be just here chilling.